Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, COVID, resilience, well being, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community plan, prepare, and respond to adverse situations and overcome them. Today, I have a special guest, someone who's actually been on the Voice America show. Let me see, three times. I actually went through and got the dates. We've talked about business continuity management, risk management, and dependencies. And we go back. The last time he appeared was 2018, January 25th. And I want to welcome back to the show, but first time on YouTube, my friend and colleague, Alvaro Orrantia. Alvaro, welcome.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for inviting me over to the show. It's great to be in touch with you, and I cannot believe it was almost 3 years the last time we spoke through Voice America. Time flies.
I know, I couldn't believe it. I thought, no, yeah, he was on a few times. It can't be that far. And then when I wrote the dates down, I went, oh my God, yeah, it was quite a while ago. And I know you and I have been going back and forth. Yeah, we got to get back on again. We got to touch base again. And it just never happened. But today it did.
Yes.
So I'm glad. But just in case nobody knows about those episodes on Voice America, do you want to take a minute or two and just tell us about yourself and how you got into this business continuity world of ours?
Well, yes, thank you. So, like many practitioners, we just came across the role that we're playing. In many years ago, I started getting into it little by little when I was back in Colombia, like 25 years ago. So, essentially, my experience on business continuity dates around 1996, which is quite a bit. Again, I feel old and time flies. In After a little bit, I started getting more and more involved until it became pretty much my full-time job, and I even had an opportunity to consult for clients of mine on business continuity, crisis, the whole spectrum, including emergency management, incident response, disaster recovery. And lately, I've been transitioning. So this is a bit of my portfolio, but not the only thing I've been doing. So lately, I've been working quite a bit more on cybersecurity, risk management, technology risk overall, and including, of course, business continuity near and dear.
Well, I'm glad to have you back because we're going to talk about an article you recently had published on the DRE website. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, that's the Disaster Recovery Information Exchange, the Toronto chapter, right?
Correct.
Right. And is that still run by Joe Azorio?
It's Joe Osorio, yeah.
Joe Azorio is still there. Hi, Joe, if you're watching this. So you had this article published and it was entitled Crisis in Times of COVID. And we're going to talk about that. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. You and I have shared a few situations over the years when we used to work together. SARS, blackout.
Correct. Yes. And after that, we had to deal with avian flu and also swine flu. Like we had just taken slightly separate paths, but at that time, I remember many of my clients were inquiring about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember SARS specifically. You were in one office and I was in the other when we used to actually just be a couple of desks apart. We had to split our team in half. And I remember my Ben, I think it was Ben and I went to one office and the rest of the team stayed in another in the main facility. And then something that still makes me laugh is the big blackout. And I was in my car trying to get home and couldn't figure out why, traffic was so bad and all the traffic lights were out. And you and I started to go back and forth going, yeah, we got a power outage too. But it was before anyone knew what was going on.
Yeah, that too. So it was two events almost in a row, and I do remember also some of our critical technology personnel were actually split between our primary data center, our alternate data center, and our head office, just to prevent any issues with personnel shortage. And then, of course, we get to deal with the blackout. Yes, it was a very interesting opportunity to see how we would respond and actually how well we responded.
Yeah, I remember all of that. I keep that in the back of my head. It just always chuckles me when, when we realized what was going on. I was still sitting in my car trying to get home.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So let's get to your article, Crisis in Times of COVID. As I said, published with DRE Toronto. So was there anything that sparked the desire to write the article, an idea or an occurrence that thought, hey, let's put this article together?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think it is important to clarify before answering that question that what I wrote in the article and what we're going to talk about really are my personal opinions. So it does not necessarily mean this is the opinion of my current or past employers or future employers for that matter. So with that in mind, yes. So the one of the persons associated with DRE had approached me in the past, and I wrote another article in the past around cybersecurity and DR testing, and approached me again just for something more around crisis management. And I tried to put something together that I wanted to be relevant for the times that we're going through, and also just to take into account my most recent experience and most recent challenge, right? So yeah, so all organizations or most of them are facing some sort of a crisis at times of COVID. But I wanted to emphasize on many things that perhaps in our world as business continuity practitioners, sometimes we don't get to see. And I wanted to build on that as learning opportunities for further resilience and for better planning.
Now there's a couple of phrases in your article that I wanted to just kind of point out. You mentioned all hazards at the same time. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because we typically, as business continuity practitioners, think about what do we do if this happens, and then we have the normal cycle of maybe just planning the proactive part of it and assessment, and then detection, and then response, and then we call recovery and stand down. But in this specific situation with COVID-19, we have not stood down. We are still operating under crisis. And with the current pandemic plans being activated, then I thought, okay, so what else can happen? And actually, things started to happen. So I started seeing hurricanes in the Caribbean. There were earthquakes here and there. There were acts of civil unrest and violence that were deemed, in this case, significant business continuity events that needed to be taken into account during our overall crisis management for COVID. But I found that also many of our provisions for pandemic planning were not necessarily applicable because the conditions had changed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I started thinking, oh, we need to look at this into more detail and get prepared properly so we can react, because normally we just foresee just one event coming and going and then another event and so on, but not 2 or 3 events at the same time.
Yeah, traditionally we always think of a basic situation, and we have a plan, a response for it, but we don't start crossing. How do you put it? The cross dependencies between different plans. While you're in a hurricane, something else can happen. We're in COVID,
Yeah.
well, obviously, and you gave a great list of examples. Other things can happen as well. Now, how do you juggle that? How do you prioritize? And we're going to touch on that word soon, I know. But
Yeah.
how do you deal with all these different situations occurring at the same time?
Yeah, and if you recall, when we started our conversation, you talked about SARS and you talked about the blackout. So SARS came and went, and then we had the blackout. Lucky us, right? But in this case, COVID came, and COVID isn't going anywhere, at least not for the short term. And
Mhm.
we're our goal almost in Canada going to be almost about a year already in pandemic mode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another phrase you have in your article that jumped out at me too. BCP on BCP. What did you mean by that?
Well, that was mostly a bit of a catchy name that we wanted to have in place for people to understand that on top of the BCP, we need to build a BCP. In the approach that we were taking essentially was more like a combination of those events. And in our world of BCM practitioners, we always think of the most basic loss types, so facility, personnel, technology, third-party loss. But then, so one of those is a BCP event, right? And then we happen to have another one of those. So the BCP event that we're looking at depends on how you see it, typically around personnel loss, which is the pandemic. Sometimes people call it facility loss, but let's say is a BCP event. And then on top of that, we had clear BCP on BCP events. We had another BCP happening, like an earthquake, that would affect your facility could eventually affect people and so on and so forth. So that was a way to just to get everybody's attention and start working on it.
Yeah, well, it goes back to even your point where more than one situation happens at a time. It's got to be a
Correct.
challenge, but it's also got to be a challenge now to try and figure out, okay, we're in a situation, what can happen now? You
Hmm.
can be in an earthquake and say, okay, my people can't come, my facility's fallen down, there's no phone lines, whatever. I don't want to say that's easy, but that's what people will think. Now it's, you got to think of all of that. Oh, and now there's civil unrest and COVID. It's got to be quite the challenge to try and even think beyond what we have traditionally been thinking.
Yeah, and that's why I actually mentioned a few bullet points that hopefully could help people understand what I was talking about. And many times, whenever I've come to see a very large problem, a monolithic problem, I just divide it into manageable chunks, right? So in this case, it was like, okay, so we are doing this. What can happen? So let's break it down. Let's break down that question of what could happen. So we are right now operating under the constraints of a pandemic. What could happen is, okay, what if we lose the facility? And then let's break it down into more chunks. What is a facility? Oh, then we found that it was, yes, the corporate facility for some areas of corporations in general who need to have people on their corporate sites, but also the facility nowadays has become our homes for many people. So we have an additional degree of complexity that we needed to dissect a little bit more to understand things better. With the understanding of those things, we'll be able to put together some strategies, and then from the strategies, more specific action plans.
Well, let's get into that because I think you started to scratch the surface on these bullet points. Your first bullet point, and I mentioned it earlier, prioritize. With what you just described and your first bullet point being prioritized, does that mean as you go through this, when things happen, you have to change and be adaptable to what you're doing? Is that what you meant by prioritize?
I meant that, but also just to keep in mind always the priorities of the business, because many times when we see, okay, we are operating under, again, a pandemic circumstances, and then, oh, we lose our home. But saying we lose our home or we lose our facility is still a little bit too broad. It's different to say we lose our corporate facility from we lose our home from we lose the home of a critical employee, right? Or an employee who is involved really in a critical business process. That's why I'm saying prioritizing. So once you see things with that lens or that extra lens of further granularity, you're going to be able to even be more effective. So what you would think otherwise would be just a massive solution for all of the employees, maybe ends up being a combination of a smaller solution for those critical employees and a larger risk acceptance, which is another one of the items. So that way it becomes way more manageable, digestible, and even affordable for organizations.
Okay. Your next bullet point, divide and conquer. Now, I think you kind of alluded to this already as well.
Totally, yes. So again, looking at it as a another event, you break it down. So again, so we know what to do in case we have a corporate facility, a personal facility, put it this way, a loss on top of a pandemic. Then what else? So technology, and many people say, oh, I'm not going to lose my data center. Yes, but now let's split the technology again. So we just divide that and conquer. So there's the personal technology as my personal computer, a corporate computer, and the overall core back office technology for the organization. And what's absolutely key of all that is well, your third parties. Your third parties become a little bit more complex because you're looking at a corporate massive third party, but at your little individual third party, which is your hydro or your ISP, for example, which happens quite a lot. Or many people I know of have those situations at a personal level that impact them. But
Mhm.
now again, being detached from the corporate hardened facility, it has a little bit more impact, right? And of course, itself the part of personal loss, which we are already trying to address, right? Now, for example, in that case, we're seeing nowadays, or we saw, hopefully, a second wave coming up, right? So what happens if we get those things happening, right?
What's the challenge with trying to even come up with those kind of situations? Do you have to, let's say, I'm in Guelph and I know you're in the GTA area, then looking at like the vendor example you gave, ISP providers, mine goes down, yours is up. as someone, documenting these plans, how do you address my ISP, or do you just have to make assumptions, on your end? How do we capture that and get it, so that we know if Alex's ISP goes down, how are you going to know? First of all, I'm just not online,
Mhm.
so what do we do? How do you capture that? There's got to be challenges with trying to figure that out with so many people at home these days.
That's right, and I think part of the challenge was just being at the same time high level enough and structured enough for people to understand what we wanted to accomplish, but also empower the people who are in front of the process to figure things out. So while I may have a personal and a corporate cell phone, others may not. And while in this case, if I lose my ISP, maybe I have also a home line and I can contact my colleagues. So it's just allowing people to be creative while we just give them a few nuggets, a few ideas that they may choose or may not choose to implement depending on their specific situation. So there's of course your specific home setup. Say some people do not have a phone line, a home line. Some people do have two cell phones. Some people do not want the organization to know that data because that's personal data. So it's empowering everyone to manage that to the best of their capabilities. But whenever there's no way out for either, like maybe a technical restriction or maybe a privacy restriction or any other kind of a constraint, then it's also leading people to say, okay, we cannot go past this point. So the best result in this case is to consider an acceptance of the risk that we're running.
I guess that's with some of the points you just brought up, you also have to have some sort of an education and awareness now in place so that somebody like me would know that, right?
Yes, so in the process of conducting the BCP on BCP initiatives in general, I think people need to understand um, what the combination means. And it was not straightforward for me as a practitioner who's been doing this again for many years, let alone for people who do this on an annual basis, perhaps. So I think it is very important that there's an awareness process where we just articulate, this is what we're trying to accomplish, this is why, and with real examples. So as I was rolling this out, for example, I found many cases where people were not able to join my awareness sessions because there had been a windstorm the day before and their ISP was down.
Hmm.
So when they told me, hey, such and such person cannot join, this is why. Example, this is why. So people would actually feel it, would see and would correlate and understand what it meant. In addition to that, the other thing that came to be very useful is, or that would come to be very useful in general, is just to put together examples. So what does it mean, a BCP on BCP? So it means this. So if we are having a pandemic and a facility loss, it means a pandemic was declared, and on top of that, we have an earthquake, something more tangible that people can understand and grasp to say, okay, now I get it, right? And
Mhm.
then what do I do with that? Okay, so these are the possibilities. Pick one, pick many, and then elaborate on those.
And
Right?
and I guess that kind of touches on the next 2 points actually you talked about: be broad and be granular.
Yes. Yeah. So it is interesting to be broad in the sense of just um, opening up to any option. So I remember one of the possible strategies that I would urge everybody to consider was, hey, if you think that you are at risk of hydro loss, hey, how about a power generator? And many people say, you're crazy, right? But it's better to tell me proactively you're crazy than them to find out reactively, hey, that would have been a good option. I actually have one, or my neighbor has one. Right?
Mhm.
So it is important to put it on the table, even if it is just crazy and broad. So people always, the message is open up to the crazies of the ideas because they may work, right? But at the same time, be granular in terms of dissecting the problem and also in looking at the smallest portion of it, because many times just a little teeny tiny problem results in a bigger crisis. So be granular up to that level without just getting to the point of splitting hairs, but having a good level of granularity so you can understand what could happen and how to manage it.
And I think that's a good segue into your next point. There's no small third party.
Yeah, correct. So you may think that a little local ISP is small, but if you happen to be a critical employee involved in the critical process and your ISP is down because your neighbor cut the cable when he or she was mowing the lawn, then it's a big problem. So it can generate into a big problem, right? So that was the message. There's no small third party. Plan around, right? So
Mhm.
so in many people say, well, how can I plan around my third party, for example, my ISP being down? Well, once you put it on the table, again, you apply the concept of being broad and being granular too. So hey, maybe there's a local restaurant that has an open signal and you need to send an urgent email saying I'm down. That's a possibility. Maybe you can just talk to your neighbor and say, can I get your password for a second? Just get a few emails. But be open and be broad at the same time as well, right?
Yeah, my neighbor up at the cottage has a generator, and there's no way in the middle of winter they could survive without having a generator. And we have actually at one time shared passwords when somebody has an issue, so that they can still get critical emails from their kids, and we're able to still do what we need to do if we need to. So yeah,
Yeah.
we've looked at some of those different ideas that we hadn't looked at before. you know and now you've got your next point is leverage connectedness. That's a mouthful.
Yes.
What's that one?
So every time I'm more and more amazed on how connected we all are, right? And how quickly news travel. So if organizations operate in different jurisdictions that have different approaches to their crisis, so call it a pandemic, but you could call it an earthquake or a local crisis of any nature, right? They will respond in a different way. So you might find locations where you have more flexibility that you can leverage than others, but also you will find many times that is worth exploring cross-training people. So if for example there's a wider event affecting an area, say the blackout that we went through, maybe there's other group in your organization in another location that is not impacted and can be used to get you going, right? Maybe even in another country if there's larger organizations as well. So it is important to take that into consideration. Again, you don't want to just start calling people and ask them to do something they don't know how to do it, right? It's something that is worth exploring and planning proactively on it. So that's important to leverage that. And because we are connected nowadays, it's much easier just to tell people, hey, you need to do this. This is how I'm going to train you, as opposed just to even thinking of in the old time just preparing manuals and books and sending them to people. Now it's very easy just to get people up to speed and getting the help you need.
And the next point, consider local circumstances. Do you mean if something happens or options within that local area?
Both actually. So if something happens, again, there's a local response, right? But it may be a little bit different from another region's response. So again, one part of the concept is leverage that kind of flexibility. So for example, like we're seeing today in Toronto, there's a certain response today to our lockdown, and in the GTA is a little bit different. GTA non-Toronto is a little bit different. So if we expand that, what can be leveraged to the benefit of the organization. The other thing too is each organization may be subject to different possible events. So during a pandemic in the Caribbean, the local circumstances dictate that in the summer there's going to be hurricanes. So think of that as well, consider that as well. So what would work? It's probably less likely that they go through a terrorist attack, but more likely that they go through a hurricane. And what are the consequences of a hurricane and how can we plan around?
Hmm. I like the topic of local circumstances. Almost a year ago, I was in a training course, and I was up the cottage, and internet's kind of spotty. We had a power outage. I had to drive a half hour to the nearest town, park in the parking lot, and you, instead of Zoom or MS Meetings or whatever application we use, I had to dial in with my cell phone so I could still hear what was going on in the training session. It wasn't the greatest way, but I was sitting there in the car, it's cold outside, with the cell phone on the dashboard, writing notes in the driver's seat against the steering wheel, trying to find different ways so I could keep going.
Yeah. Well,
So,
actually, on that note, many years ago, something like that happened to me. Like I needed to be available for an incident that had just occurred, and I didn't have many years ago. I didn't have a cell phone. I only had a pager. So the next thing I had, instead of just driving for a couple hours just to get home, the next thing I found was a payphone, and I had a 1-800 number. So I dialed into it, and I joined my call, and I was able just to at least take some notes and know what was going on, and getting everything prepared. So it is the local circumstances of where you are, but also at a regional level.
yeah.
What are the responses options from the local governments, from the larger central, provincial, federal government, from your organization, to what restrictions do you think you will be facing, and what kind of events you'll be exposed to?
Yeah. And just to clarify, when I was in that parking lot at the cottage, we don't get cell service. So that's why I couldn't do it. That's why I had to drive in. Now, your last
There you go.
point,
It gets tricky sometimes.
yeah, oh yeah, it was, and cold. The last point in your article is don't fear risk acceptance. Why not?
Because I think we got to break the paradigm with the right rationale, of course. That if I don't know what to do, I'll just accept the risk. So accepting the risk is not necessarily a result of not knowing what to do. In fact, accepting a risk is knowing what the consequences are and saying there's nothing else that is feasible for me to do. I mean, I do know what to do, but it's not feasible. Put it that way. So it also requires a good and sound understanding of the business. So these are the consequences, right? And this is how it's going to impact the business. So knowing those details and articulating it that way um, could and should, where needed, result in risk acceptance. And that's why I was actually starting that whole concept of good enough. So we need as practitioners understand the business and the concept of good enough. So getting to this point is the best we can do, is good enough. And of course, we obviously need the business to win, but we shouldn't fear that. It's not really a statement of not knowing, but it's actually a statement of actually knowing and making a conscious decision to say this is where we draw the line and where we accept the risk.
What kind of, just for listeners and viewers, what kind of things would make or lead a leadership and organization to accept a risk? Is it just money, or could it be, some other type of thing?
Um, it could be several things, right? So it could be a combination of money, productivity. You can argue that everything can be translated into money, but there's things like, again, productivity and just burning people out, for example, if you are really just hammering on a small team that needs to cover for everybody, right? So there's things that cannot be quantified, of course, the reputation and other items that are hard to be quantified. But a combination of all those items, if articulated properly in front of the business, it will help them understand a recommendation for risk assessment, or even just take it to that point. So it is a combination of those things.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end, actually. We've talked about your article, Crisis in Times of COVID, published on the toronto.drie.org website. So everyone go take a look. Alvaro, I'll give you a minute or two. Do you have any final thoughts or comments you'd like to pass along?
Well, I think in everything, we should look at the opportunity behind the problem. In this case, it's no different. So as practitioners, this many people react and say, "Oh, this is really bad enough, right?" So to be dealing with any event, or an event, it doesn't matter. But it always has lessons to be looked at and to be learned from. In this case, it's no different. So I think the pandemic has shown many things, have shattered many paradigms, even from the simple thing of managerial work and driven by objectives versus by face time, but also from the point of view of crisis and business continuity management. And I see this as an opportunity for the BCM practitioners to really get more and more involved into the business, to understand the business, and to put in front of the business the value add that they bring.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. Alvaro, thanks very much for sharing your time and talking about your article here. I really appreciate it. And it's great to have you back for a fourth time. We've been trying for ages, like I said at the beginning, to get you back. So I'm happy to have you finally joining me again here.
Thank you, Alex. Very happy to be here as well, share some thoughts and experience, and of course, just help the community as much as we can.
And I know, because you and I talk every so often, we've been friends for quite a while now. You'll be back for a fifth one, I'm sure.
I will be glad to. Thank you.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. To everybody watching, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.